Today's video is called Things Wrong with My Brain. And I don't just mean like the way I think, or these are actual things that are wrong with my brain, not just things that I think that you don't agree with. So, start with the easy ones, I guess. I used to have dyslexia. It made it to where words were jumbled. It still comes out occasionally when my brain goes faster than my hands. So when I'm typing, quite often, if I start typing quickly, all the consonants will come out and then all the vowels. Don't know why. Don't know how I managed to beat it. And I'm not suggesting that generally dyslexia is beatable, because for most people it's probably not. But it eventually, mine went away. It may have been all the blows to the head. It is quite possible. I did used to fight a lot. 2, speaking of blows to the head, at some point I got facial dysmorphia. I have no idea when exactly this kicked in. It basically means that I don't see faces as whole images, or at least not till I get to know somebody. There used to be these things on social media where it's lines of dots. And if you focus on one line of dots, the other ones blur and you can't see them. That's how it is for me with faces. So if I have memorized your eyes, then seeing another part of your face, I may not recognize you. Eventually, the longer I know somebody and the more I'm able to connect their images to a whole, I'm actually able to see the whole face. And it doesn't affect people that I've known for a while. Like, when I see old friends, their faces are not like the heads-up display like new people. So that's super weird. Even friends who've undergone dramatic changes, like gender reassignment, or have lost or gained lots of weight, or even had cancer and stuff. They still, for some reason, their faces are still fully visible to me. I don't understand this, and it may not be something wrong with my brain, but I think it is. Now we're getting into more of the metaphysical stuff. I have never been diagnosed autistic, and I hate it when people self-diagnose. But a lot of the markers for autism are, I am very, very focused on patterns and rules. I am irrationally angry when people do things that don't make sense to me, or defy something that I'm like, I know that they know they're not supposed to do that. And I have a lot of coping mechanisms for the routines and behaviors, and again, that may not be autism, but every person I know who has been diagnosed has had very similar issues socially to the ones that I have. But again, I think I built up my coping mechanisms over time, eventually to where functionally I'm okay. But it also really, really bothers me when people I also am. I've narrowed the people it applies to. Like people in responsibility, I get very much more upset with them than kids, because lots of kids are. Let's face it, lots of kids are dumb, and I don't mean that they lack intelligence. I mean that they do really dumb things. When I was a kid, I did really, really dumb things. The last one is much more metaphysical and more meaningful to a lot of people. And this is where it kind of becomes a story. As I understand it, most people have a voice inside their head. As I understand it, most people know when something is right or wrong. They have an inner morality. They have an inner voice that tells them when they're doing something wrong. It says this is wrong, or it says this is right, and it has showers you with good feelings, and you feel guilty when you do something that's wrong. I don't think I have that voice. I don't know that I've ever had that voice. Most of my versions of right or wrong come from the effects of my actions. And so for me, right is something that benefits the most people that I care about and damages the least number of people that I can. This doesn't always work. And actually, this is part of where the Batman thinking came from initially, is because I didn't know how people would react to certain things, because I don't understand other people very well. It takes me a while to build a pattern to understand people. Once I understand somebody's pattern or patterns, it's much easier to understand them. But until I know somebody's patterns, I am guileless. I am either completely trusting or completely not trusting. And part of this came from growing up with a family full of alcoholics, because alcoholics are unpredictable. They don't make sense. They quite often, they'll say one thing, and how they are when they're sober is completely different from how they are when they're not. So they may be the most honest, trustworthy person in the world when sober, and then that just goes right out the window. So pattern recognition is something I'm really, really good at. But because I don't have like the sense of right and wrong, I didn't really understand when things were bad until I saw their effects. And I know a lot of people that do bad things for the thrill of it, but I don't get a thrill out of doing bad things because I don't have that voice in my head. I know a lot of people who don't do things because of the shame. I don't really have that either. The only time I feel bad is when I see the effects of what I have done and it hurts somebody. Usually somebody I care about means more, but hurt somebody that I care about is when I realize something is bad. As I said, this led to the Batman thinking, because Batman thinking is trying to plan for every eventuality and possibility. I'm sure you've met those jerks who are like, oh yeah, well, what would you do if somebody swung a bat at you right now? Or at least I knew a lot of those people who would basically make up complicated scenarios of how they would deal with things. You know, the super martial artsy guys who would be like, oh yeah, what do you do? And I always hated it, but my brain did it anyway. So my brain would plan for ridiculous contingencies that would never happen. What would I do if a coworker offered to sleep with me? How would I turn them down in a way that did not ruin my relationship with them? What would I do if one of my students jumped out the window? How would I handle that? You know, what would the step-by-step me dealing with that be? And so for the longest time, I would spend all this time thinking about how to deal with these very unlikely scenarios. And the problem is, this is a very American thing. Lots of Americans imagine statistically incredibly unlikely scenarios to justify things that they want to do. And so, like, that's part of the gun culture thing. I'll get into that at some point, I'm sure. And it's also part of the anti-vax thing, and it's part of almost everything that's wrong with America comes from the misunderstanding of statistics. And so it's one of those things where you think that it's much more likely that you're going to have to do this heroic thing. And so then you start setting yourself up to do that. But because my brain didn't have the thrill part or the shame part that most people seem to have, I would dream up these scenarios so that, not because it was fun, like for lots of people, not because it gave me an inherent sense of superiority, like lots of people, but because then I could control the situation. I would always know how I acted. And so I seemed to many of my friends to be very decisive, because they would ask me something and I'd immediately have an answer. Just done. Answer. And they thought I was decisive. It's just that I thought of it before. And it got to where I was thinking of this, like, every time I'd walk into a room, I'd be like, okay, What would happen if I had to fight this whole room? Okay, where would my escape be? Okay, what's a usable weapon? And that's not how people should think. That is not how interactions should work. You should not always be planning to beat the people around you. You should not always be planning to deal with threats that are just not likely to happen. And you shouldn't be thinking about the fact that, oh, well, what if this incredibly unlikely scenario would happen? And don't get me wrong, in America, that helped me. That served me. I was prepared for all kinds of random crap that did happen. When, I got mugged once, only been mugged once. When I got mugged, I knew exactly how much money I was willing to give up. And if I had more than that, then I might have been willing to argue about it. But because I had less than that, I was like, this guy's probably desperate. Good for him. The problem is that with Batman thinking, and when you tie it into not really having a sense of this is right, this is wrong, I had to think out a lot of scenarios that I didn't really enjoy thinking about. They were things like, okay, well, what if this person cheats on their spouse? How do I feel about them? Whose side do I take? And part of that was my pattern recognition going into overdrive, because I would see that something was about to happen. And the problem with being able to predict what's about to happen, especially socially, is that people think that you caused it if you call it out before it happens. And this is why you should never watch movies with me, or at least you should never let me talk during movies, because most of the time, if there's good foreshadowing, I know the end before we get there. And it got to where in the US I would be watching horror movies with friends, and we'd get a third of the way through it, and I'd be like, oh, and all my friends would go, shut up. Just shut up. I'd be like, okay. But we'd get to the end, and I'd write down what the ending was, and we'd get to the end, and they flip it over, like, God damn it. So, very, very good at predicting patterns. Again, a lot of this comes from different places, and I'll probably talk about the origins of some of this stuff at some point. But for the most part, those are the things that are wrong with my brain. I have a couple of bonuses because of them. Like I said, the coping strategies, it's really, really useful to people that I know when they don't have coping strategies to give them some of mine, and then they're good. So it's one of those things where, these brain things, they're not debilitating anymore because I've mostly figured out how to work around them. And, I also found other people, like there are like 4 people in my life that when I come up against a situation that I have no idea what the right answer is, they have strong moral compasses. And I can go, okay, this thing that I want to do, is it wrong? And they're like, well, can you even do that? And I'm like, yes, I can. But should I? And they're like, no. And I was like, okay, cool. Thanks. So I trust those people that have moral compasses. And shout out to them because they're amazing. But yeah, other people in my life, not so much. Anyway, those are things wrong with my brain. This is your new video. Thank you.